Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. Actually, can you hear me well in the back? Because I might roam around a little bit, so I'm gonna stray from the microphone. So I want to talk about authoritarianism and polarization, and I'm giving due credit to Mark Hetherington. He's a close friend of mine and my co-author. And among Mark's talents is that he is the statistician and the methodologist of the two of us. So we do a lot of data crunching in the book. I'm not going to get technical tonight at all. I'm just going to talk substantively about our findings. But the statistical work we did, I do think is important in helping us to make what I think are pretty strong claims about why we think authoritarianism explains so much now about American politics. And I'm obviously going to explain a little bit about what I mean by authoritarianism, and then develop some our arguments for why authoritarianism is such a powerful explanation for our deeply divided political system. So I wanted to just start by showing you this. Don't worry about all the graph. Let me just tell you substantively what this represents. We did a very simple statistical model in which we wanted to explain whether a state would vote for Kerry or Bush in 2004. And there are basically two variables in the model that we built for this particular purpose. One is party identification, and the other is the likelihood that people would endorse corporal punishment, spanking children, in order to discipline them. And incredibly, what we found is that if you had to know just one thing in order to predict whether a state voted Democrat or Republican for Kerry or Bush in 2004, and you had to choose between whether how people answered the spanking question on the one hand or how they answered the party ID question on the other hand, you were better off knowing how they answered the spanking question. Okay? And I think that speaks to a very interesting new reality in American politics. And that reality is that our divisions have gone far beyond policy, and in a sense even far beyond ideology, to something much deeper, much more visceral, based perhaps in personality. Although we can talk about personality, it's a problematic concept, but something very deep-seated and visceral and rooted in what we refer to as a worldview. And these very profound worldview differences are really now at the root of polarization in American politics. And because our divisions now are divided along these really gut core senses of right and wrong, the way the world should work, etc., almost pre-political, we're finding that it's much more difficult to find common ground than was the case in the past. It's one thing to have disagreements about tax rates. If you think income tax rates should be 40% and I think they should be 20%, well, in principle, there's a middle ground that we could find on that issue. But if the differences are rooted in these deep-seated worldview differences and personality, in the most fundamental senses of right and wrong that we have about the way the world should be organized, well, then finding that common ground is going to be a lot more difficult. And what we argue is that those personality differences, one of the best ways to understand those personality differences as they affect political polarization is to think in terms of this concept of authoritarianism. I always forget that I have to keep pushing the button to get these. So I'm going to very briefly mention what we mean by polarization before we start talking about authoritarianism. I'm not going to read each of these individually, but essentially what we're talking about is a situation in which issues arise that divide people deeply, and that people feel incredibly strongly about, that divide people deeply, and that become really prominent on the public agenda. So if, 40 years ago, some people might have felt strongly about gay rights, for example, but that wasn't an issue on the public agenda. And therefore, it was not going to have the power to meaningfully divide people the way it is now. So in order for polarization to take place, it's one thing for people to feel strongly and deeply and differently about issues, but we need that other component, which is that those issues about which people feel deeply and strongly and differently come to play a prominent role in our public debates. And I'll come back and talk more about that in a few minutes. But so, as I mentioned a moment ago, in order to think about these very deep-seated worldview differences, we thought a very useful way to think about those differences was in terms of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is an old research program in the social sciences that originally emerged 6 or 7 decades ago to explain why there would be mass support for fascism, for example. And a bunch of researchers started to wonder to what degree people with authoritarian personalities existed in democratic societies like the United States. There's a whole sort of troubled history that this research program went through. It largely fell out of favor by the 1960s and 1970s, but we believe that it has very useful things to say about the political divide in America today. So I'm going to start by briefly defining what we mean by authoritarianism. We think that it includes a strong need for order. I'm just reading the slide here, with a tendency to rely on established authority to achieve it. And among the important personality traits or sensibilities that come out of that need for order are, among other things, an aversion to ambiguity, a sense that a desire for kind of clear, black and white thinking, a sense that the world is divided, consists of a struggle between good and evil, a tendency to organize the world in terms of an us versus them struggle, what we sometimes refer to as ethnocentrism, not just racism, but other forms of kind of us versus them thinking, and a tendency to support forceful solutions to problems. And again, I'm going to elaborate on this in greater detail as we go along. But these are some of the basic attributes of authoritarianism, motivated to a significant degree by a particularly strong need for order, and I would add a kind of a deep-seated discomfort with change in society. Okay, so how do we measure authoritarianism? Well, this is where the concept has gotten into trouble over the years. And its reemergence has coincided with a new kind of slimmed down set of questions to measure people's levels of authoritarianism. And interestingly, the way we measure authoritarianism is by asking people how they think kids should be raised. And after I go through this very quickly, I'm going to spend a few minutes defending this approach to measuring authoritarianism and explaining why actually it does a quite good job of doing what we want it to do. So you can see the preamble there. People giving these surveys ask respondents. They read that preamble. People have different ideas about what qualities they think it's important for children to have. And now we're going to ask you which one you think is more important for a child to have from these 4 pairs. And so let me say very briefly that typically when people see this, their first response is, for example, you're being asked to choose between independence and respect for elders. Typically what people say is, well, I want my kid to have both. I mean, why am I being asked to choose between any of these? Curiosity sounds good, but so does good manners. I don't want my kid to be, a disgusting slob out in public. So I think that's a common, nearly universal response that we get. Typically, on surveys, this isn't always true, but typically on surveys, the respondents are forced to choose. And what justifies that, in our view, in an analysis that's trying to explain political polarization, is that just like here, in politics, people are forced to make choices. You may like something, in 2008, for example, believe it or not, I think there were quite a few people who liked some things about John McCain and some things about Barack Obama. But I'm going to have to insert a Chicago joke here, but outside of Chicago, you only get to vote once. You have to choose. And so likewise, we think it's valid for our purposes to force people to choose, because ultimately that requires people to establish priorities. I like good manners and I like curiosity, but if I have to ask myself which one is more important for my kid, well, curiosity is more important to me. So these are the 4 questions that respondents are asked, and on that basis we just come up with a simple scale, 0 to 1. If you answer 0 questions in an authoritarian direction, you score a 0. If you answer 4 questions in an authoritarian direction, you score a 1. And just to dispense with the suspense right now, I will tell you that the non-authoritarian answers are independence, self-reliance, curiosity, and being considerate. And I'm happy in the question and answer, if we want to go back and talk about this slide or anything, of course, in more detail, I'm happy to do that. But so respondents who gave those 4 answers are scored as non-authoritarian, and those who gave the opposite are scored as authoritarian. And of course, most people are not at 0 or 1. They're somewhere in the middle. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight sort of is based on the 0s and 1s, because I think those 0s and 1s are driving much of our polarization, but it is worth remembering that most people, like they do in ideological surveys and other political surveys, don't fall at either extreme, but they answer 1 question in an authoritarian direction or 2 questions. So that's the basic measure. What's the justification for using child-rearing to explain these much larger worldviews? Well, there's a long history going back to French child development specialist Jean Piaget and the great American philosopher John Dewey, and many since. But one I thought particularly useful quote that I just wanted to quickly read here is from a guy who studied tolerance, writing in the early 1960s, based on surveys he did in Indiana in the 1950s. He used questions not exactly the same as the 4 I just showed you, but quite similar. And he argued that the subject of child-rearing techniques pinpoints a fundamental proposition in human affairs. How should people, superordinate parents in this case, treat other people, subordinate children in this case? I see I left out a parenthetical there. Should parent-offspring relations be based on mutual trust, genuine affection and cooperation, or is the ideal relationship an authoritarian one based upon power, fear, obedience to a power figure, and mutual distrust? And Martin found in his own studies, he was primarily attempting to explain how tolerant people were of difference, particularly race in his case, but also other differences. He found that by far the most powerful variables for explaining differences in tolerance were his child-rearing variables. And we have found similarly that though these 4 questions about child-rearing would seem to be very far afield from the sort of immediate subject matter we're interested in, which is political polarization, it turns out that how people answer these 4 questions give us extraordinarily powerful results, which are consistent with our larger analysis. Okay, and before I'm going to get to some of those results, so let me just add in a little further explanation here for our understanding of authoritarianism. Traditionally, the study of authoritarianism has focused on authoritarians themselves, and non-authoritarians are sort of a default category. We believe that the nature of polarization today, is not driven simply by authoritarians moving in one direction, but by authoritarians moving in one direction and non-authoritarians moving in another direction, politically speaking. In other words, the polarization is being driven by both sides of this spectrum. And given that fact, we think it's worth trying to understand not only what the characteristics of authoritarianism are, although I do think in important senses they've driven this dynamic over the last 40 years, but also understanding some of the key characteristics of non-authoritarians, who, as I said, I think have also played a significant role in this polarization, especially in the last couple of decades. And I'm just going to briefly go through these, and again, if there's interest in the Q&A, we can talk about these in more detail. But we've identified 4 features. One we say is fairness as outgroup preference. So a belief on the part of non-authoritarians that public policy should be tilted as much as possible in the direction of helping groups that were historically discriminated against. Affirmative action would be one example. There would be other examples. A second is accuracy motivation, a particularly strong investment, and there's all kinds of studies to substantiate this, a particularly strong investment in facts ruling the day over emotions and other kinds of considerations, really related to the first one, a general aversion to ethnocentrism, and a fourth characteristic, a strong belief in personal autonomy. And again, I'm happy to discuss that in more detail during Q&A if there's interest. Okay, so let me show you some data here. This is on the question of whether the world is a struggle between good and evil by people's level of authoritarianism, and you could just see a couple of data points on here worth pointing out. Among low authoritarians, 25% strongly disagree with the proposition that the world is a struggle between good and evil, while among high authoritarians, only 6% strongly disagree. So 4 times as many low authoritarians disagree. And at the other end of the spectrum, among those who strongly agree with the proposition that the world is a struggle between good and evil, only 17% of authoritarians feel that way, whereas 17% of low authoritarians feel that way, whereas 40% of high authoritarians feel that way. So a very stark difference between low authoritarians and high authoritarians on this quite fundamental question. And then here's more, which I just think these results are really fascinating and compelling and sort of speak to the question, well, what is it that these 4 child-rearing questions are really answering? So we had a question in a survey in 2006 about a man who admits he's in favor of terrorism against the United States by Muslims, and he writes a book criticizing the United States. The book is in your local public library. Do you favor removing it? Those who scored at the minimum, only 12% said yes, remove the book. And those who scored at the maximum, 79% said yes, remove the book. And I want to say that in social science research, these kinds of findings, the starkness of the differences are almost unheard of. And they give us a good deal of confidence that these 4 child-rearing questions, they are getting at something very significant and fundamental related to our political world. Let me just show you a couple more pieces of data. We also asked a bunch of questions in 2006 about immigration, whether it was a threat to the economy, whether immigrants should adopt the American culture, whether illegal immigrants are lawbreakers, plain and simple, and whether the respondents are against the path to citizenship. And note, among those scoring at the minimum of authoritarianism, 38% believe that illegal immigrants are lawbreakers, plain and simple, whereas at the maximum, 82% believe that illegal immigrants are lawbreakers, plain and simple. Again, an enormous difference based on these 4 questions about how kids should be raised. A few more data points just to show you quickly. This is support for various items on the gay rights agenda. I'll point out the second one here, gay marriage. Among those scoring at the minimum of authoritarianism, a full 71% support gay marriage, and those at the maximum, 19% support gay marriage, so about 4 times as many non-authoritarians support gay marriage as authoritarians do. And these are more powerful findings than you'd find, for example, polling Democrats versus Republicans or liberals versus conservatives. So again, I think that this is providing a very powerful explanation for polarization. This is a list of questions about forceful solutions to political problems, whether strength over diplomacy is most important, whether the war in Iraq was a mistake, whether we need to focus primarily on the national interest versus allied support. And again, you can see these differences between the minimum and the maximum, 2.5 to 3 times, 2.5 to 3 times difference between minimum and maximum on these issues. And one more set in this sort of run here. This is percent supporting reductions to civil liberties and the use of force, again by authoritarianism. Among those scoring at the minimum, I'm looking at the left-hand column there, only 20% support warrantless wiretapping. And at the maximum, 60% do. If you move over to the 4th column, support media censorship, 27% at the minimum do, and 79% at the maximum do. So again, these are really overwhelming differences. Okay, so how did we get here? This is one question we try to at least begin to take a stab at in the book. And we relied on what we think is a very interesting and compelling theory in political science. It's the theory of issue evolution. And it basically says that every once in a while, some phenomenon comes along that sort of fundamentally changes the nature of political competition in the United States. And according to issue evolution, that phenomenon is some issue, some very significant issue that comes along and kind of reorders political competition and causes people to kind of reconsider their old political loyalties. And the classic example is race and the impact that race had on the party system and political competition in the United States beginning in the 1960s. The way in which race, for example, began to drive many white working class voters out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party, particularly with Richard Nixon's silent majority campaign in 1968. And what we argue is that it hasn't just been one issue that's driven this polarization over the last 40 years. It's been an accumulation of issues. The founding issue in this kind of 40-year cycle, we do believe, was race. And then a series of other issues came along that have deepened this particular personality-based divide. Law and order in the 60s and 70s, feminism in the 70s and 80s. You know, feminism, I gave a talk about this earlier today and I mentioned this. You know, feminism is an interesting example if we take the Equal Rights Amendment. Until 1972, there was no difference between the Democrats and Republicans on ERA. Both were highly supportive. And in fact, when Congress voted to pass the ERA amendment in 1972, they did so by overwhelming majorities. I don't know if any of you remember a congresswoman named Bella Abzug. Is that name? Okay. So she was actually my congresswoman when I was growing up in New York City. I remember her big fancy hats and walking in the neighborhood and meeting and greeting voters. And she had, you know, she was quoted as saying at one point, you know, we just kept throwing stuff onto the congressional agenda related to women's rights because everything we threw up on the agenda, Congress passed. No one wanted to be seen as opposed to women's rights. This is as late as 1972. And by 1980, we have something very different, which is an increasingly supportive Democratic Party on women's rights and an increasingly resistant Republican Party. And in fact, in 1980, for the first time, the Republican Party, for the first time in several decades, I believe, the Republican Party no longer supports the ERA in its political platform. So we have feminism and then gay rights in the 1990s and then the war on terrorism. And what's meaningful about all of these issues is that all of these issues, for the reasons we've talked about before, the different ways in which authoritarians and non-authoritarians process information, the different ways in which they think about order and change in society, and the different policy positions that flow from those very different kind of sensibilities about the world, all of these issues happen to hit people at that particular dimension. All of these issues are issues that authoritarians and non-authoritarians are likely to think profoundly differently about. And as those issues emerged on the public agenda, remember I said at the beginning that polarization requires salience. for it to sort of operate. As these issues emerge as prominent issues on the public agenda, and they happen, all of them, to kind of reinforce a growing divide between authoritarians and non-authoritarians, that accumulation of issues and division and differing worldviews sort of brought us to the point that we're at now. And again, I want to emphasize that nobody got into a room, gathered in a room in 1969 and said, let's figure out what we can do to attract the authoritarians, okay? What politicians always do is they try to figure out how do we win elections. That's what they care about. And they care about constructing coalitions that can help them win those elections. And it happens that these issues, for various reasons, were among the key issues that political elites thought, if we can make these issues prominent in the public eye, we can attract winning political coalitions. So it was a matter of, I would say, short-term political calculus and a variety of other historical factors that brought these issues to the fore and then made authoritarianism the incredibly salient dividing point that it's become over the last 40 years, and especially in the last 10 or 15 years. So I very briefly want to show you this graph. This is a look at differences between Republicans and Democrats on some key kind of dimensions, sort of dimensions related to people's basic outlooks. There's a measure of moral traditionalism, another measure of racial resentment. I'm not going to detail those. But I do want to point out to you, I can use the pointer. Okay. So if you look at that black box right there in 1992 at the 0 line, and the black box refers to differences in authoritarianism, what that's telling us is that in 1992, there was really no difference between the average Democrat and the average Republican in their level of authoritarianism. Okay? And as you can see, as of 2004, there had become a 10-point difference. Republicans had become more authoritarian, Democrats had become less authoritarian, and I can tell you that that number, that difference is greater now than it was in 2004. So something very significant has changed in the last 20 years, and again, we think authoritarianism is an important part of that change. It's by no means the only one, of course. I mentioned the moral traditionalism difference, and I know that's relevant to people in faith-based communities, of course, particularly, and you can see that in 1988, there was about a 4-point difference in this moral traditionalism scale. That scale asks questions like whether you believe the Bible is the literal word of God and things like that. And you can see that in 2004, the difference is over 15 points. So there's a significant change there as well. I'm going to skip a couple of these. Okay. Can someone give me a time check? 6:35. Okay. I'm going to do this very quickly, and then I'm going to open the floor to questions, because I think, particularly for an Arkansas audience, this will be interesting. This division we've talked about, obviously we think it drives national politics. We think it drives polarization between Democrats and Republicans. We also found that it worked in a very interesting way in the Democratic primary in 2008, especially after Hillary Clinton fell behind. Barack Obama was no longer the front runner and began to kind of remake herself as a populist politician who was appealing to, as the media said over and over again, white working class voters, and that Obama, in addition to appealing to African Americans, was appealing to more educated white voters. And we see something very interesting here, that level of authoritarianism appears to be an incredibly powerful explanation for whether you supported Obama or Clinton in 2008. Among those scoring at the authoritarian minimum, 76% supported Obama and 24% Hillary. So that's an overwhelming 3-to-1 advantage for Obama among non-authoritarians. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, among those giving 4 authoritarian responses, 69% preferred Clinton and 31% Obama. And I want to show you one more slide. Since the narrative was so focused on white working class voters going for Hillary, I want to show you something which casts doubt on that explanation, or muddies it, let's say. and it's sort of another reason why authoritarianism is such a powerful explanation for what's going on right now. If you look in the upper left-hand cell there, you'll see that those folks are folks who had a high school education or less, but scored at the lower end of the authoritarianism scale, that is low authoritarian, low education voters, and among those voters, 57% preferred Barack Obama. And if you go to the bottom right there, on the other hand, these are college or graduate degree respondents who are high in authoritarianism, and only 38% supported Obama in that category. So in other words, the key distinction here is not really between working class whites and non-working class whites. It's really between low authoritarians and high authoritarians. And that's true even when we adjust for education levels. So there's lots more information to cover and talk about, but we do want to leave good time for Q&A, so I'm happy to open the floor to questions.
If you get your hands up, we'll get a microphone to you. Annie, we'll get to you first.
Number one, when you opened your discussion, you talked about all of this is evolutionary, and it's a 40-year evolution that you concluded at the end. During that 40-year period, we did not have the impact of media and the impact of technology on those moral issues that parenting and those kinds of things. Do you have any research that is more relevant as it relates to media impact on those moral values and the geography of the studies?
So two questions. I'll start with the geography question first. We do have state level data, and there is certainly variation by region of the country to some degree. The picture looks somewhat different in the South, for example, than it does in the Northeast. But I will say that what we find has held true across all regions. That this kind of polarization and division that we found has been in every part of the country. Now, as far as the media question, I guess there's two aspects to the media question that I wanted to mention. The first is, if you're asking about the impact of media on people's technology on people's, is it on people's morality? Is that the question? So that's a big, hard question to answer. Obviously, there are many people who think that media has become more sexualized, et cetera, and that's had an impact on people's sort of views of these things. What I would say is that as it relates to authoritarianism, things like Facebook and YouTube and the internet are obviously newer. But if you go back to the 1970s and look at the emerging new right in the 1970s, which is in many ways kind of a precursor for what we're seeing now. The new right was arguing in the 1970s that our culture had become incredibly trashy and sexualized and immoral through television and movies and things like that. So I'm not saying that to downplay the impact of new technology. What I would say is that this concern about morality and media, I think is, in some ways it's an older one. I think we've actually been hearing about it for a long time. So.
In the back.
There was an interesting essay recently, and I forget who did it, but they talked about in the authoritarianism the role of the father in the family, and you could tell some of your statistics by to what degree the father is still the, I think that may be it, or similar to that.
Continue.
To what degree the father, if you believe he's the authority, then you feel a certain way about a whole range of issues, and the degree to which you feel that there is mixed authority or the woman has equal authority, it moves to the other direction. So does that fit in with your theory as well?
Absolutely. So there's a guy named George Lakoff, who's the second guy here, who's an eminent cognitive researcher, and he has been writing about what he calls moral politics for many years. and has talked about the liberal-conservative divide in terms of, this fundamental difference in moral outlook, with the conservative worldview sort of embodied in a strict father morality, a very kind of top-down, hierarchical, rules-based way of organizing a family and a society more broadly, and then a sort of liberal sensibility embodied in what he calls a nurturant parent morality, this idea that parent-child relations are collaborative and based on greater equality of various sorts. And more broadly, the reason I created this slide and the one after it is, I think that this gendered language that has so suffused our politics and has identified Democrats and liberals as kind of, what did Arnold Schwarzenegger say at the 2004 convention? Democrats, girly man, economic policies, this kind of language, and Republicans as tough guys, et cetera, I think has really suffused our politics. And I do think it tracks very clearly in some important way with what we're talking about, the differences between the kind of decisiveness and clarity that authoritarians want versus the complexity and ambiguity. In 2008, Obama said something very interesting during the campaign. He was being criticized by Hillary, I believe, for one of his foreign policy positions. And he said something to the effect of, we don't do nuance very well in this country. And what struck me about that quote was that it was probably, okay, I have no basis for this claim, but I'm going to make it anyway. It was probably the first time in American history that a politician of that high profile was actually endorsing nuance. Right? I mean, this is not something that I feel like American politicians have done. And I think that speaks to this kind of real, profound, evolving worldview difference. That's what non-authoritarians are craving. And it's what authoritarians find to be anathema. And I think a consequence is, this gets to why this polarization feels so rancorous and difficult, is that we feel like, I'm on one side of the political spectrum, and I look at people on the other side of the political spectrum, and I think, I don't even understand how they can think the way they do. It just doesn't even make sense to me. And so I feel like that's kind of what we're dealing with now.
Bob, right here.
I was curious if you examine fear in any form. I see that as something of an underlay to all of this stuff, the need for structure, and that the mommy versus daddy on a strong protective figure as just a real root of all this, and also something that's been exaggerated in the last several years to try to seemingly control the masses better.
Well, it's a very interesting question you raise. Fear is, I would say, fundamental to this conversation. And my own thinking about fear has evolved a little bit even since we wrote the book. I do think that there's some basic sense in which authoritarians are more fearful and therefore require certain policies and a certain societal structure in order to make themselves feel better. And I still think that's true in important senses, but what I've come to think about more is how authoritarians and non-authoritarians experience fear differently. So one way I've thought about it, and my co-author and I are actually about to start some experiments with some unwitting undergraduates. But we want to think about how these two groups think about and experience fear differently. So what I think about is the degree to which non-authoritarians, I would say, experience fear as a kind of neurotic anxiety, and authoritarians experience fear as some kind of more direct, visceral threat to their immediate well-being. So to give an example, authoritarians are much more afraid of terrorism and the likelihood that there will be some catastrophic attack that will kill them. Non-authoritarians are more afraid of climate change. which is, I think it's a very different kind of fear. It's based on a different way of thinking, I think, cognitively about cause and effect and what the threats are to our well-being. So this requires a lot of development, but I think there are differences in how these two groups experience fear, which I think only add to the polarization, because I think they don't recognize each other's fears at all, and feel very strongly about their own.
Okay.
What experts who don't agree with you, what is their position on this? Where do they try to poke holes in this, or how do they criticize this this theory or this way of explaining things? I'm just curious to hear the other side of the story.
The research is flawless, so that can't. I'm of course kidding. So there's a few things that people say. There have been, I think one thing that people would argue in a kind of very basic conceptual way is that for us to argue that it's the right wing that's authoritarian, when in fact it's people on the left who are more supportive of government intervention in all sorts of ways, it's just fundamentally counterintuitive and doesn't square with our own categories. And I think that speaks to actually a student in the talk I gave this afternoon asked a really good question and raised a really good point, and this sort of goes along with different experiences of fear, which is, don't authoritarians and non-authoritarians just have different conceptions of order and different ideas of what we need to do to build orders that we can feel stable and secure in? So I think that's one response, which is a very legitimate response to our work. I think in terms of the findings themselves, what we've gotten from a lot of political scientists, which I find interesting, and again, my co-author can speak to this better than I can because he's the methodologist. A lot of political scientists say, your data works. These are statistically significant findings. They're very powerful findings. But on some basic level, we do not buy that those 4 questions are explaining what you think they explain, because it just seems too far removed from what you're talking about. And I'm personally convinced, obviously, but I don't think that that's wrong. I guess my response to that response is, well, until you can come up with an alternative theory, I think we have a pretty good explanation for how our theory and data fit. But I don't think it's unreasonable for people to wonder, why are these questions about childrearing explaining what they're explaining? I think there's an interesting black box there that we have not yet opened. So,
when you developed your sample of people you were going to then question and rate in terms of who's more authoritarian, who's less, and so forth, and then when you did your analysis, did you look at whether there's any differences of significance based on gender or based on age group? Were the 20-year-olds more authoritarian than the 60-year-olds?
Yes. So,
Males versus females.
So what I didn't show here, we have lots of models based on regression analysis where we make sure that we control for all sorts of variables: gender, race, age, income, party affiliation, you name it. And regardless of the controls we use, we still find that authoritarianism has this very powerful statistical relationship to the things we're talking about. However, I would say a couple of things. One, older folks do tend to be somewhat more authoritarian than younger folks. And whether that's a cohort or generational effect. So will a 20-year-old today be more authoritarian in 40 years? Maybe, or maybe for the question, because of the question you asked, because of media influences, et cetera, they're just going to grow up thinking differently. I mean, I think on the issue of gay rights, for example, there's no question that this generation, they don't care, and they are going to think differently about gay rights throughout their life cycle compared to older folks today. Gender, my gut would have been that there would be a difference between men and women, and there really isn't one, actually. I'll tell you the most interesting difference. There are differences between demographic groups. So African Americans score very high in authoritarianism, and obviously they don't work with our theory at all because they score very high in authoritarianism and they are still overwhelmingly democratic, in fact now more so than ever. And I think there are interesting and complicated reasons for that. On some social issues, for example, gay marriage, et cetera, I think there would be a more consistent relationship. Hispanic is about average, and I'm Jewish, so this happens to be of interest to me. Jews are by far the lowest authoritarian group in the country, which is a whole other story. But so it's an interesting question. So we do find not the differences that we would have expected in some of these groups.
Right there.
I was wondering if you have any historical perspective on this. In other words, is this a cycle that ebbs and flows in our society, or are we on an upward trend that's going to end with us all fighting each other in the streets?
Well, I think it's a great question. I guess my personal opinion is, this is something we talked about earlier today, somewhere around the year 2042, according to our best estimates, the United States will become a majority-minority country. Whites will be in the minority in the United States sometime in the next 30 years. And when I think about the direction we're heading in demographically, the Republican Party they've given up on African Americans. And I think for a while when George W. Bush was president, they were trying for the Hispanic vote. And then I think their sort of reaction to Sonia Sotomayor during her confirmation hearings, their position on immigration, for example, I think has more or less signaled that they've given up on Hispanic voters too. And when Hispanics and African Americans are 20% of the electorate, it's already a dicey strategy. When they're 35 or 40% of the electorate, I mean, again, this is my opinion, it's game over. And so I do think that some profound change will be compelled in the next 30 years by these profound demographic changes that are taking place. My own opinion is that what will happen is eventually the Republican Party will change. That their current appeals, which are overwhelmingly to white and older voters, will at some point become unviable. And like any political party interested in actually winning elections, they might not change right away, but they will eventually. Yeah.
Here's what's happening with Wisconsin, Indiana, and Ohio, sort of an indication that they're also beginning to give up on the working middle class.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I'm tempted to say they did that a long time ago, but on that question I would say yes and no, because I mean, from my point of view, they clearly have, but from their point of view, the way to appeal to that voter is not to their economic interests, but to their cultural and identity interests. And so I do think that they continue to believe that they can be successful making those sorts of appeals. I personally think in the long run, it's clearly a losing strategy. But I also think the logic of this is that they are locked into a particular base with a particular worldview, and they need to reflect that base's interests and worldview, even if in a longer term sense it's not a political winner. So.
Yeah. It's coming around.
Many of us feel that this polarization is becoming extremely destructive to our country. Does your research give you any thoughts on how we can bring many of us more towards the middle?
I wish I had a better answer. Honestly, I don't know. It feels, this sort of goes back to the historical question too. Whenever you're in a particular historical period, you always feel like, well, this is just there's a logic to this, that it's going to continue in this direction, et cetera. And I know, of course, in 20 years from now, we'd be having a very different conversation and one that we can't anticipate today. But I guess my feeling is that at least for the near future, everything continues to point in this direction. I think the nature of the difference in the bases of the two political parties, the way that media functions now, the blogosphere, cable television, talk radio, et cetera, which I think has had a very powerful reinforcing effect on this polarization. It seems to me that it will continue to point in that direction. And I think what will eventually change this, but I'm not confident that's going to happen, at least in the next few years, is that these demographic changes are going to force more far-reaching changes. But I, for example, in 2008 when Obama was elected, I am not going to lie and say that I knew that this ferocity of hatred would be directed toward him. I knew Republicans wouldn't like him. I knew that they would do whatever they could to try to knock him down and regroup. It's not like I expected them to roll over for him. But I would not have anticipated what we've seen in the last few years. So I'm not confident that this cycle is going to end anytime soon.
Ready?
I had a two-part question. One was relative to the population in general, how would the population of the United States break down among the two groups? But then I'd also wanted to ask,
Good question.
What you were touching on just there, contrasting the 2008 and the 2010 elections and the tremendous differences, and how in defining the two groups, it seems like it was almost a different electorate between the two election cycles.
Between 08 and 10, you mean? Yeah. So the first question, there are lots more folks who score at the authoritarian maximum than at the minimum in the United States. And I think it's one reason why, again, my own bias, I know if you turn on Fox News, they'd have a very different view, but it's one reason why I think the Republican Party much more faithfully or thoroughgoingly reflects the authoritarian worldview than Democrats reflect the non-authoritarian worldview, because the numbers are very different. I think about 20% of the electorate scores at the authoritarian maximum, and about 10%, a little less, at the authoritarian minimum. So there is an imbalance between the two groups. As far as the difference between 08 and 2010, Jay's more of an expert on this stuff than I am, but midterm electorates are very different than presidential electorates in general. They skew whiter, they skew older, they skew richer as a proportion of the total electorate. So I'm not even, there's certainly an intensity that the Tea Party brought to politics over the last 2 years, but I think even just the fact that the Democrats held Congress and the presidency, and the midterm electorate looks the way it does, probably all by itself would have accounted for, and the fact that Democrats won a lot of seats in 06 and 08 that they probably had no business winning. I think that that's probably at least a good part of the explanation for the difference in the two elections.
We have time for two more. You're right there.
Could you go ahead and predict who might be the Republican candidate for the White House in 2012?
Boy, that's quite a field they're putting together there. I don't know. The guy who personally scares me the most, although I've talked to Jay about this, and I know he has certain baggage, which is going to make it very difficult for him, but there's one guy in the Republican field who strikes me as genuinely relatable beyond their base, and that's actually Mike Huckabee. He appears on The Daily Show. He's a likable guy. He's kind of funny. He's folksy. I don't like him personally, but he's the one guy who feels to me like he could speak beyond the Republican base. And again, I know that he has certain kinds of baggage that might make it very difficult for him to be viable. But other than that, assuming the economy continues to muddle along this way, it's pretty hard to see any of the other candidates beating Obama in 2012.
Who would score the highest on the scale? of the candidates?
Of the Republicans? Well, I don't think there's a number high enough for Michelle Bachmann on that scale. And Sarah Palin's probably right there.
Last one.
Yes. What impact will multiracial marriages have in regards to racism?
Say the question again.
What impact will multiracial marriages have in regards to racism?
In regards to racism, I mean, this is one reason why I feel like this younger generation is just going to be fundamentally different. I think they're much more used to and much more comfortable with interracial dating. Family structure and mixed ethnicity households have grown a lot in the last 10 or 15 years, and I don't see how that could not continue to be the case. So, I mean, it's certainly my hope that will strongly mitigate the effects of what we're talking about, authoritarianism, and along those lines would also, I think overall, reduce racism quite a bit. So.